You would have to have been living under a rock for the past 20 years not to be aware of how anti-consumer most entertainment industries are today, and the general levels of contempt that these companies have for properties that have been beloved for decades, especially when it comes to creating content in addition to what's already been established. At one time, these organizations created properties that were adored by millions, pieces of legitimate art that left you feeling uplifted and inspired. It used to be that huge productions were overwhelmed with dedicated and skilled craftsmen, artists, all working in lockstep to bring forth a creative vision and tell a story that would provoke the audience into new ideas, perspectives, and to encourage a generation of fledgling creatives into the entertainment arts. From the crusty boomers all the way to the baby-faced babies of Gen Z, you had actual moments of cultural significance around creative properties that became enshrined into your memory, and not buried into the deeper recesses of your mind with all the other dejecta like your forgotten Google passwords, your actual height, your will to live. Now, anytime a new piece of media is announced or proposed to be in the works, the initial feeling is not too dissimilar from the apprehension right before a rectal exam. A vaguely nauseating affair where at the end you not only feel violated, but you're also asked for money. But just like hearing screeching tires breaking fast on asphalt, you can't help but hope for an impact. For one of the few benefits from watching multi-billion-dollar companies discover new ways to lose their money equivalent to some small nation's GDP is the mental gymnastics and cognitive dissonance on display right after these things begin to fail. It's like being surprised when you jam the fork into the toaster and being blasted into the wall and then accusing the toaster of doing something wrong. Once the breadcrumbs have been consumed and all available life has been drained from the property, you will then get the playbook of denial. The suggestion that the audience interpretation is wrong, some various pseudo-political red herring bullshark, and then they get bored and go find something else to destroy. It's really becoming a kind of media roulette, with an executioner reaching into a barrel of IPs and picking at not-so-random properties that can be reimagined, re-engineered, reinterpreted, booted, interpolated, and re-fucked into some shiny new excrement that you can probably consume on a payment plan. Considering the current levels of writing ability and ingenuity on display in Hollywood, any piece of content that's even remotely palatable will be co-opted and spit-shined into something they can cram into the carousel of whatever streaming service you subscribe to. Sometimes the simplest answer is the correct one. And that is, most entertainment companies are shit at making good products. Nothing of substance will ever be designed by a committee of people who all got their degrees in how to commodify human thought from the same Ivy League schools that cost more than a house deposit to learn online at. They all seem to follow the exact same recipe on how to make additions to established franchises, which usually involves inserting current social and political ideals in a very forceful way. And this approach never ages well. It's like building the foundation of your house out of fucking sausages. People really don't want a reminder of the current state of political discourse. It's nauseating enough when you have to pay attention, let alone when you're trying to escape from that shit. And it's not that people don't want to see any politics in their media. There are dozens of examples that prove that people have an appetite for that type of content. I mean, shows like Succession, Billions, House of Cards, and even shows like Breaking Bad all explore sensitive political ideas. Most tentpole properties have been deconstructed in such a way that not only is it difficult to watch any new installations, but it makes watching the original content something akin to looking at photos of loved ones that have passed on. And it truly is a unique skill to behold. Not only can you make something new that's quite shit, but it's so incomprehensible that it pulls into its orbit everything that was actually good. It's like the inverse of having your cake and eating it too. It's not having any cake, and then knocking some cake out of somebody else's hands, and then saying that you didn't even like cake in the first place. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of properties that have yet to have been pilfered. Classics like E.T. or Jaws or The Godfather or Back to the Future. These have remained untouched, for now at least, but a lot of these movies do belong to the sci-fi genre, and that is a genre where spectacle is given a much higher priority than cohesive story. Because it sure is easier to just vomit excessive CGI visuals onto the screen than actually have to construct a compelling story, or even rewrite an old story. One such property that has historically been the victim of this type of practice is the Aliens franchise, which is held near and dear to a lot of people. These are movies that pioneered the sci-fi horror thriller genre. These movies had breathtaking practical effects at the time, and still hold up today, but it was also the claustrophobic nature of how those movies were filmed. It was also the addition of, at the time, the trope of the unknown existential threat was quite a novel one. I mean, these movies really did act as a blueprint for a lot of sci-fi horror thrillers. A blueprint that not all the Aliens movies followed. I mean, it was really just Alien and Aliens. All the other entries in this series seem to follow the philosophy of no bad ideas.
I'll do the fingering.
Some people thought that Aliens 3 and 4 deserved a little bit more credit than they got, and that's fine because some people thought that Quibi was going to be successful. However, the consensus has always been that Alien and Aliens are timeless classics of their respective genres, and that everything else was pretty much a tragic misstep in the evolution of this franchise. The first two movies are important, as they lay the foundations for how the rules of the universe get established. And they did so in a way that was intelligent and could scale for the future, but also in a way that was realistic for the audience and easy to engage with. And the reception for those two movies speaks volumes into how they were created. Everybody is in agreement that these were exceptional films, and most professionals would agree that these movies were a perfect marriage of artistic ingenuity and a market appetite for sci-fi. There is also just this subtle intangible quality about films that were created during the 70s and 80s. Those old Panavision cameras imbued so much texture and warmth through their film stock. Everything within the frame that was captured had such a viscerality to it. Nothing ever felt unintentional, yet at the same time the subtle imperfections that occurred during the film development process meant that there were all these deviations that couldn't really be replicated. I mean, even the titular Alien itself, created by H.R. Geiger, has this timeless quality to it, and no matter how many times the Alien is redesigned or reinterpreted, nothing ever beats the classic xenoform.
Perfect organism.
The production design and set design of the first two films are also still considered some of the best set designs to this day. The designers were actually pulling inspiration directly from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which really goes to show that if you set your benchmark quite high, even if you don't reach it, you still create something exceptional. If you don't have a benchmark at all, you create Aliens 3. If you have Sigourney Weaver set your benchmark, you get Aliens 4.
Who do I have to fuck to get off this boat?
And that's in no way attempting to discredit Sigourney Weaver. Her contribution to the first two movies was unparalleled, but she only joined the fourth movie because she was given producing responsibilities. A lot of her ideas were quite shit. The original concept of the truckers in space was a theme that was really appropriate for the American audience at the time. As cliche as it is, it was quite a transformational period in US history. With the conclusion of the Vietnam War, the Cold War still raging, the introductions of huge amount of recreational drug use, and really what is considered the peak of the US middle class, afforded an ample opportunity to represent a dichotomy that was well observed in the US at the time. The corporate and dictatorial elite in these newly emerged technological giants still rely on a subservient lower class labor force to grow their financial empire. This idea of a faceless bureaucracy that was coupled with the monopolistic sentiments of the time was becoming more a commonplace narrative for the American public, as they were witnessing these emerging markets in the throes of corporate avarice and excessive hedonism, exemplified by places like Wall Street and Hollywood. This in turn made the idea of the motley crew of labor force miners a perfect antidote to what was being considered something that was evaporating the American ideal, where the individual was being replaced by the ideals of globalization. And it's also fitting that the plot of Alien is a fairly simple one in itself. The crew is co-opted by Weyland-Yutani to investigate a signal of unknown origin, and then all hell breaks loose. It's a basic premise and quite a digestible one for an average audience. It's possible that an audience today is looking for something a little bit more sophisticated, not because the audience has become more intelligent, it's only because these tropes have been overused in so many different variations of this exact same idea. And it's not the simplistic plot that drove Alien to be a success, but it's the interpersonal dynamics between the characters. The character interactions in that movie are some of the most realistic and natural pieces of dialogue I've ever seen. And it's why the fear is so well translated when the alien shows up. You can genuinely see terror on a lot of their faces. They behave like normal people. If you were really lucky, the first time you saw this movie, you knew nothing about the aliens universe or the alien itself. That would have hopefully allowed the tension to be more organic. Nowadays, there is so much exposure at all stages of the developmental pipeline as well as the creative process that you're lucky if you haven't figured out the fucking ending by the first trailer. In a lot of genres, this doesn't really matter. However, when it comes to horror, your first interaction within this world is the most important because you don't know what's going to happen. Which means that over time, it's pretty much an unavoidable realization that you will have a less visceral reaction each time you engage with the horror aspects of the movie. And so why are the first two movies so important to Alien Isolation? It's because they provided a framework for the game devs to accurately translate the movie into a game format. They knew the themes and ideas and world-building elements that had to be incorporated to make it a legitimate adaptation. There has been plenty of other Alien games that have been created, but none of them really hit the mark as far as the atmosphere of Alien 1 was concerned. Lots of these games suffered from technological limitations of the time, so that's fair enough. But also, some of the games were just other games like Street Fighter reskinned with Aliens characters, but none of them ever really hit the same level of intense, atmospheric engrossment that you got from the first two movies. It wasn't really until the Aliens vs Predator series came out that those games felt like they were getting a fair shake, but in my opinion, the first legitimate Aliens experience was when Alien vs Predator came out on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It was the first entry in the franchise that felt like that it could actually live up to the expectations established by the first two movies. And even though I think most people would have probably preferred a standalone game as opposed to a crossover, what was delivered was still an admirable and fun experience for a user and demonstrated that there still is an appetite for this type of game and this type of universe. That optimism though was unfortunately very short-lived, for it was only a few years after that we got the dumpster fire that was Colonial Marines. I mean, that game was a litany of technical issues, mismanaged expectations, and an absolutely dreadful attempt to try and continue the Marines story from Aliens. I think something that didn't help the reception of this game was how disappointed people were with Prometheus, which came out a year before Colonial Marines was released, which left a very bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths and a desire for that nostalgic 80s vibe. But what we got with Prometheus, which was sort of an Aliens movie, without any aliens, without any 80s tech, without any atmosphere or tension, or good story, or interesting characters, or good movie. And I understand that people feel differently about this movie and that some people were excited about the possibility of exploring the Aliens universe from a slightly different perspective. But this movie broke one of the understood cardinal rules that you don't violate, and that's please don't try and have an explanation for the origin of the Xenos. I mean, everybody else kind of already knew not to ask this question, because I think everyone knew that there would never be a satisfying enough answer. And holy shit, was the answer we got not satisfying in the slightest. What did we get? Some Aurora Boreas-like transcendental wank. I mean, nobody wanted an answer, but that is such a piss-poor attempt at trying to come up with an origin story. I think one of the issues with this premise was, when Prometheus came out in 2012, we had already had a series of movies that have anthropomorphized their subject matter. Just another epistemiological foray into man's quest for a divine creator. It's just boring. And now, because that's what Ridley wanted, the universe has been altered in a way that every subsequent entry has to adhere to these types of rules. Yet this is what Ridley Scott wanted. If you listen to some of his director's commentary on Prometheus, you get a pretty clear idea that this guy wasn't entertaining anyone's ideas but his own. An extract of that commentary, he said, "I do have a vision. I know exactly what I want. Shut the fuck up. This is what I want. Fuck it. That's it. I've got more films in this goddamn building and 3 in the Library of Congress, and people are still going, what are you doing that for? And all those people are usually very inexperienced or fundamentally stupid." So that does not exactly sound like the air of democratic idea sharing. I mean, one of the issues that people had with Prometheus and Covenant is they have this very refined Hollywood slick sci-fi aesthetic to them. And that was one of the reasons people felt quite disconnected from these movies as opposed to Aliens and Alien, as in some of that rich texture and spirit had been lost. and had been replaced with something that was quite overly engineered and had this general cool sterility that had been applied to all the visuals. And because Colonial Marines and Prometheus and all these other entries had not really hit that nostalgic mark that everyone was trying to achieve, by the time Alien Isolation was released, people were absolutely desperate to have an experience that was likened to the one of Alien and Aliens. And that's exactly what we got. It was the confluence of all the aspects that made that first movie such a marvel. The rich characters, the intriguing story, the engrossing world, the retro-futuristic aesthetic applied to all the technology within the universe, and the glorious Alien itself brought back from obscurity in a well-needed return to form. The Xeno is as formidable and terror-inducing as it's ever been. Alien Isolation has definitely been elevated up into the class of video games that are some of the best ever made, especially for the horror genre. In retrospect, it's definitely easier to see how much of an incredible feat this game really was, but if people were aware at the time, it didn't get the greatest reception upon its initial release. The two most prominent video game review publications during that period was IGN and GameSpot. Neither regaled Alien Isolation with particularly flattering reviews. It's also fairly self-evident that you shouldn't give a single modicum of fuck about what IGN reports about anything. Their journalistic integrity and commitment to transparency is about as honest as anything coming out of the Chinese Politburo. However, the overall decline of those publications was not as well observed at the time, so when the original reporter Ryan McCaffrey gave Alien Isolation 5.9 out of 10, the impact was actually quite significant on the initial sales of the game. Because who would have thought that allowing journalists to have priority access to your video game as well as to special events and special donations would end up altering the decision about a game's quality? I mean, who would have thought that? The cinematic opening sequence alone was a good indicator of the type of quality that you could expect throughout the game. The production value was incredibly high, with realistic environments and dynamic lighting, realistic character design even down to perspiration on the skin, subtle facial animations when someone is talking. But really, the meat of this game is the satisfying environments that you get to take Amanda through. As soon as you exit out of the cutscenes, you can see the incredible attention to detail to make a realistic translation from the first Aliens movie to this game. I also don't think I'm ever gonna get tired of that sort of functional yet industrial retro-futuristic cassette style that's applied throughout the game. It just breathes life into every atmosphere and adds so much more texture to the world. And all those amazing visuals are complemented by the excellent sound design, from pulling samples from the first and second movie, as well as coming up with a unique combination of other sounds that would help fill out the rest of the world. From the low oscillating drones of the ships moving through space, and to the creakiness of wails of the internal structures, as well as the beeps and various other miscellaneous noises being made by the technology in-game.
Please wait for security check.
And all those elements are so easily accessible due to the minimalistic approach when it comes to the HUD and other system controls on screen. This allows you to be more present in the game and pay attention to things that are actually occurring. It's a nice reprieve from a lot of games where the standard seems to be to get as much UI on the screen as possible at any given time, just in case you actually have to stop playing to take your ADHD medication. Having the gaming mechanics actually built into the interactivity of physical objects in the world was another victory for the immersion of this game. Like saving the game becomes more than just pausing and exiting, you have to interact with an object within the world and there's inherent risk to that. It's not a get out of jail free card and there are consequences to how you engage in the world before you use these save points. And that's good because it makes your actions actually feel important. It gives more weight to what's happening in any given moment. You can't just abuse the save points, you have to actually carefully navigate your way to them. It also means that whilst you're using the glorious CRT scanline monitors, You have to be aware that the alien can still interrupt that action and kill you if you're not careful. The threat is still there. You are not removed from the danger just because you're interacting with a contextual screen outside of the actual game. It's also another moment where you can see how much attention to detail was given to that DOS aesthetic with all the monitors and controls in the game. And it's interesting because if you look at old DOS-based systems from the 70s and 80s, they didn't look anywhere near as interesting and as well balanced as they're portrayed in this game. And that has everything to do with the lighting. Every light source that emits a glow within this game feels realistic. The subtle blooming and halation effects around every light source really add this intriguing dynamism to the world. I mean, every moment feels theatrical. It's especially apparent when you get to sections where you use the flares or you see a subtle mist or fog that seems to be moving through the environment, as well as the scenes that have alarm lights or fires going off because it bounces and reflects light around the objects in the room, and you get this incredible contrast with these amazing shadows which just really make the game look spectacular. It's one of those games where any given moment could be a wallpapered screenshot. Because of the effort that was put into the lighting and the level of texturing in the environment, just about every shot almost looks like it's a cinematic. This is obviously helped a lot by the fact that it's easier to make darker environments look more contrasting and detailed because you can hide a lot of the imperfection in places where the light doesn't reach. And lighting is one of those art forms that is often lost in modern media. We really forget how important it is to understand the physical properties of the way light reflects around certain objects. But light is one of the most sophisticated and useful tools you have in your storytelling arsenal. It can be used in a very obvious way to indicate where a player should be going, or it can be used more subtly to indicate certain objects that you can interact with. It can be used to describe how a character is feeling, or the emotional tone of the environment that they're in. There are certain genres of games that don't require as much attention to be placed on the lighting, but when it comes to horror, it kind of makes or breaks your game, but Alien Isolation knocked this one out of the park. The lighting delivers the aesthetics and visual qualities that we came to expect from that first movie. Because of the minimalist UI, the game does take advantage of the crafting system. In 2013, this type of system mechanic had more or less been implemented in good faith, unlike today where crafting systems are ham-fisted into every single game to ensure the maximum amount of bloat possible. In Isolation though, this system is quite functional, and depending on your difficulty, it can make or break your run, as it forces you to be incredibly conservative with how you use each component. An important distinction is also the fact that items can overlap, meaning you have to give a priority to your playstyle. Are you going to craft an item such as the noisemaker or the smoke bomb to play more defensively? Or go balls out with the Molotov or the pipe bomb? These decisions will have an impact on the level of difficulty of certain sections throughout the game. And again, this makes the atmosphere of Isolation feel more realistic. There is not an infinite amount of components that you can scavenge to build your items with. You have to be intentional with not only deciding what to craft, but to go out into the environment and find the specific components that you need. Too many games are guilty of arbitrarily adding shops and crafting mechanics to make it feel deeper or like there's more to do. But often this leads to a disproportionate amount of time engaging in useless secondary scavenging as opposed to actually playing the primary objective. But for the most part, it just inundates the player with too many options that don't really have a meaningful impact on the outcome of the game. Witcher 3. It is one of my all-time favorite games, but the level of crafting in that is just ridiculous. So I think Isolation has a good balance with the number of items that you can craft and their overall utility in the game. However, they are not some type of life raft. They just make certain sections a little easier to bear, so long as you've done some basic planning prior. A good example of that risk-reward dynamic is the motion tracker. It's super helpful, but on the harder difficulties, the alien can actually hear the beeping pulse from the tracker, meaning every time you use it, you're actually giving away your position. Just another little sphincter tightening exercise that you can engage with throughout this game. Kind of like when you're using the access tuner to unlock the doors. You're always trying to do those things as fast as possible just in case the alien's about to drop down, so you end up fucking it up and having to restart the whole process all over again, even though if you'd just committed a second more of patience on the final little puzzle, you would have got through the first time. The sounds from the motion tracker were actually a combination of both the first and the second movie.
Okay, I'm through.
the subtle rhythmic pulse that the tracker emits is such a good metaphor for the human heart. The closer you get, the faster it goes, the more tension is created. I also thought the decision to blur the background while using the tracker was a really smart choice, as it does continue the theme of the risk-reward dynamic. You can't use the tracker without removing some visibility, which means the alien has more of a chance to sneak up on you because your vision is obscured. I actually found that with every playthrough of the game, I used the tracker less and less. It becomes more of a hindrance than an actual piece of utility, as not only does the Xeno move around quickly, kind of distorting the accuracy of the tracker, but it picks up all other motion as well, so you're never 100% sure if it's actually the Xeno. To comment more on the sound design, however, it's often an aspect that can be full of cliches, especially when it comes to games that belong to the thriller or horror genre. You quite often get the standard chromatic progressions, microtonal shifts, drones, huge echoing reverbs, pieces of sound design that are effective in those genres, but are often not that unique. But Isolation does such a good job of incorporating original sound design aspects from the first and second movie and augmenting them in a way that's more applicable to an interactive format. The original soundtrack was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, who combined these lush, almost romantic string quartet pieces to give some bombast and scale to the spectacle, with these very dissonant, almost Pink Floydian-like synth whirls and trill. But the primary motif was this constant tension between fear and a sense of hopefulness. But the score just keeps going on in this perpetually apprehensive manner. It never really lets you relax too long, but it also makes sure to bring in appropriate moments of relief so you don't get fatigued from all the suspense. This was well achieved through a collection of diegetic in-game sounds as well as the dynamic underlying score, all of which sounded incredibly appropriate to the alien world, some of which were exact recreations and some new additions which were faithfully contributed to this ever-expanding world.
Samuels! You're alive! It's Ripley!
Ripley!
Some of the sound design of this game was created by the director Jeff Van Dyke. He goes into detail in an interview just how careful they were when it came to incorporating some of these sounds into the game, making these critical decisions about how to use certain aspects of the sound design to give a more impactful experience. One such creative decision was combining some of the alien sounds mixed into the sounds of the doors opening. This is so that when you're moving through the environment, sometimes you think the alien is going to be on the other side of the door or is right behind you. It's small aspects like that that you're not actively paying attention to that enhance the fear and apprehension, as you can't just use jump scares endlessly as that format gets really fatiguing. Another decision was to make the alien clearly audible, using repeatable sounds to indicate the patterns of behavior, to be able to project its location out into the environment and so you could opine its trajectory. This was a departure from how the alien has been presented in previous medias, as previously the alien was made out to be the ultimate stealth assassin, able to sneak up on unsuspecting victims without being heard and capture them and removing them without anyone taking notice. And it's not that the Xenos never made any noise previously, it's just that whenever they did, it was usually very intentional or that they'd already been exposed in some way.
Ripley, this is a public hospital. There has to be an evacuation procedure.
Like when Ripley battles the Queen Xeno on the Sulaco, the alien discards any subtlety and just starts stomping around like you hear in Isolation. I think this also ties into the motivations of each individual alien, as one of the interesting critiques I read about Isolation Xenos is they behave more animalistically and not the stealthy, near ghost-like apparitions of the first two films. I think this is actually a fair point, but I don't know if it would have worked making the alien exactly the way it was in the movie. I mean, the whole premise of the original movie is there was nothing that you could really do. This is the ultimate predator, there is no escape. So I think if you had to play through Isolation without actually being able to hear the alien, or without the aliens' telegraphed footsteps, I'm not sure many people would actually be able to finish that game. However, if you do want that purest experience, you can download mods on PC that will remove all sounds of the alien. Combine that with the random Xeno AI mod, and you've got the cardiological equivalent of CrossFit. One of the sounds that I always enjoyed in the game was the synthetic Joes. Synthetic humanoids have been included in every single Alien property since the first movie. They are an intrinsic part of what makes the Aliens world unique. Their inclusion was not just a smart decision from a gameplay perspective, but reinforces the motivations of a company like Weyland-Yutani. They would reserve their most sophisticated synthetics like Samuels or Ash or David for more complicated interactions with human beings, ones that require subtle manipulation or coercion. But for a mining station like Sevastopol, the pretense of a sophisticated synthetic is simply not needed. It also wouldn't really make sense considering the number of synthetics seem to exist on this station. Synthetics at the higher levels of sophistication like Ash and Samuels must represent a significantly larger investment compared to the working Joes. So their presence continues on in the theme that a station like Sevastopol is built like an industrial factory, with functionality and compartmentalized simplicity to allow for easy maintenance and adaptation in the future. But their function in-game is a really important one, as they provide much needed tension relief, as the alien is almost unrelenting throughout the entire duration of the game. So sections with the synthetics allow you to control the outcome a little bit more predictably. They also just make you feel slightly better when they're around, as you know the alien might be distracted by them making noise as opposed to you making noise. But if the synthetics didn't exist, the runtime of this game would have had to have been lowered significantly, as it was one of the primary complaints about the game was its excessive length. However, I think removing the synthetics would have made the game more fatiguing than less. You need those moments with the synthetics so you can take a break. It's an opportunity to reset and explore the world without knowing that at any moment you're going to be killed. They also continue the themes that a lot of the films represent, about the dangers of sentient machines or powerful centralized AIs like Apollo, and how easy it is to have their primary utility be co-opted by some special interest or malevolent operator. And this anxiety is even more relevant today than it was back in the 80s. It's a sobering reflection of how often our hubris interferes with our intentions. And it's not like their addition is something new, as they've always been present since the first installment. But I think some of these criticisms come down to a fundamentally different attitude towards the game. People who care about the Aliens franchise and people who don't. Because a lot of the initial reception seemed to be directed towards the game's length and the repetitive nature of some of the tasks. And I really feel like this just comes down to whether or not you care about the world that you inhabit. As someone who played through most of the Resident Evil games, there's a lot of repetitive tasks in those games as well, but I enjoy the atmosphere so I'm willing to persist. Even games like Outlast, Dead Space, Silent Hill, and even Amnesia all have moments of repetition, and an argument can be made that there is significant amounts of runtime that could be cut from each of those entries. So if the narrative structure isn't very interesting and the gameplay doesn't engage you, then I completely understand why someone might find an experience that takes 20 hours to be pretty grueling. But I also think this comes down to people who want to play pure horror games and people who want to play horror action. I think a lot of the time, players just like to have their character have a lot more physical agency by being able to utilize weapons and other tactics to be the aggressor, as opposed to spending the entire game being on the defensive and being completely vulnerable to the whims of the game mechanics. I think this is why so many horror games have weapons in them. It just makes you feel like you have more control of the outcome. Mistakes can be made, but that's due to player error as opposed to in-game mechanical inconsistency. It's also completely fair enough to just not like this game, that's understandable. It does just seem to be pretty rare that people who actually like the franchise take any issue with some of the criticisms being made about the game. But those critics need to understand the entire point of this game was to mimic the first movie. Ripley had no way to actually kill the alien in the first movie. Only small deterrence and delay tactics, things that wouldn't have really worked long term anyway. If you wanted your character to have more agency and be able to dominate the alien in a more physical way, then this really wasn't the game for you. That experience would be more akin to the second Aliens movie, and games like Aliens vs Predator and the excellent Aliens Dark Descent allow you to have an experience in a more traditional action thriller side of that sci-fi spectrum, with guns and vehicles and all that machismo. Both those experiences are great in their own way, but if Amanda had weapons and could harm or kill the alien, the game would be over in like an hour. And don't get me wrong, having an experience with Alien Isolation level graphics that behaved more like an action shooter is definitely something that people have an appetite for. But that was not the objective of Isolation, nor was it the objective of the first movie. It's possible that people would have liked to see more long-term impacts on the alien when you use weapons on it, such as the pistol or the flamethrower. Perhaps being able to injure the alien would have made the resource scarcity feel more significant and more like the player was actively making a long-term decision, as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction to a sudden threat, which can just endlessly repeat itself throughout the game. Whilst the alien does actually adapt to the weapons you use on the game, I think it would have been interesting to have more of a significant impact with the flamethrower, because after multiple playthroughs, once you have the flamethrower, you're really kind of safe if you know how to use that thing correctly. It takes about 2 blasts of the flame and you can get the alien to retreat. Every now and then it violates that formula and I've never really figured out why, but for the most part it's pretty consistent. It would have been interesting to see that if you'd shot the alien that it started to drip acid blood throughout the environments and become even more enraged and animalistic. So there's just a Hansel and Gretel trail of acid blood misleading you. Maybe the Xeno was so enraged that when it enters the environment it just runs around the entire time. So there are some small things that they could have done to tweak it, but a lot of these things really seem more like difficulty settings than actual fundamental gameplay changes. This all ties into the formulaic nature of the Xeno's behavior, and as a criticism I think that is a fair one, but as I've just mentioned, I'm just not sure what they could have done to be able to alter it to the point of a more organic and realistic behavior without making the game significantly harder. Enough people already commented on how the save terminals were not as forgiving, and how a lot of players were not used to that type of save mechanic, and most people are used to auto-saves and immediate checkpoints. I also think the sluggishness of your movements and interactions felt more punishing if you had to repeat certain actions or areas again. But again, that was the whole point of the game. You're not some gunslinging super soldier master chief running balls out every single time. You're just an average person that has never encountered anything remotely like the alien before, or maybe ever even held a gun, or fired one. You are a scared and vulnerable person and your every move has a potential consequence. There is a risk and reward paradigm to staying still as well as to constantly moving about. This is also a game that is quite punishing if you're trying to be too precise in how you approach every single area. And I know there are people who have successfully done a no-death nightmare level run, but even those videos show that there is always some subtle deviation into the way the game behaves. But I also think it's important to remember the slow nature of how you interact with all the different elements in the world reinforce the realism of the environment you're in. You are not a hyper-vigilant super soldier. You cannot complete every task in an unrealistic amount of time. The mechanisms in-game are based on a realistic estimation of how long it would take to do some of these actions. And this is good because it means you can't abuse any of these mechanics to your benefit. You can't just sprint to the end of the level and then autosave. I mean, think about how long it takes you to make a piece of toast or log into Neopets, let alone use a giant heavy multi-tool to remove a hydraulic door lock or log into a computer and navigate through archives of files. Shit takes time and you can't rush, exactly the way it was in the first movie. People considered their actions before they performed them. Another criticism of the game that I felt was a broad criticism of the horror genre, not Alien Isolation specifically, was talking about the additional threats that needed to exist on Sevastopol, like the NPCs and the synthetics. And again, this just has to do with the intrinsically detrimental aspects of overexposure. The more you engage in the horror aspect of the game you are playing, the less afraid of it you become. This is a piece of engagement phenomenon that we can all understand, but there's not really much you can realistically do about that. But one of the only meaningful ways that you can do this is to resensitize yourself to the subject matter, which means you just have to take a break. This also highlights the inefficiency of a lot of game critics. These people are usually playing the game in a very time-sensitive capacity, meaning that the modality of your consumption is directly influencing how you perceive the game. That means any criticisms that you have formulated at the start of the game become artificially elevated by the end because you have concentrated this play window to an unrealistic amount of time because you are negatively incentivized to complete it quickly. And a lot of gaming journalists are very much guilty of the old back cover review. This exposure problem is not just about in-game issues, it's about the audience's blatant awareness of every single aspect of the alien that has been revealed for the past 40 years. Of course, some of the terror is going to diminish, but this is true for any gaming mechanism. The first time I played Battlefield 1, I was blown away, literally, every 2 seconds by some larger-than-life explosion, event, or player behavior. It was an exhilarating experience. But just like the slowly diminishing return from methamphetamines or the 50th Pringle as opposed to the first, eventually you have to take a break. Horror games aren't usually the genre that I would pick first anyway. I remember several years ago playing Slender Man with my friends in a slightly altered state of mind and being totally consumed by the fear of that game. But when I returned to that game years later on my own, I couldn't have given a shit about a single thing that was happening. And I was playing that in the perfect environment, at night time with headphones on. But the fear was entirely absent. That game had become a meme by that point, so there was no way I was going to be engaged like I was when I first played it. This also reiterates exactly why the reveal from Prometheus and Covenant about the origin of the alien was such a sack punch, as your imagination is what drives a huge amount of your fear and anxiety. It's the irrationality of what could happen and what an unknown apex predator could mean about the nature of the universe. But no, Ridley wanted goo, so we got the goo. Fear and suspense is also a difficult thing to manage, especially across a long duration. It's much easier to scare the shit out of somebody in 5 minutes, as opposed to having to continuously scare someone over the duration of 20 hours. Which is why the criticism of the early gameplay and the fact that the alien takes too long to appear is an absolute baseless argument. The original movie doesn't just drop you into the midst of the horror straight away, it needs to build the tension slowly. You can't have 20 hours of non-stop alien horror. And despite what a lot of ADHD-riddled edges might tell you, delayed gratification and the absence of stimulation can make upcoming stimulation much better. It can leave you right on the edge. It's like people have never watched any actual horror-based art, but have consumed too much pseudo-jumpscare YouTube prank bile horse shit, and now don't know how to sit still unless they are sucking or drinking or puffing or chewing or whatever else you can do with just one hand on the joystick. Alien Isolation is a really masterful experience that's only let down by the increasing notoriety and exposure of the scripted events in-game. It's the same principle for all other media formats. For when you haven't read a certain book or watched a certain movie, the more you learn about it from others, about what that experience was like, the more you're going to be influenced in your own experience. People are really suggestible, and if you get enough people parroting the same positive or negative ideas, then it becomes ingrained into your own perception. So just like all entertainment media, you're better off consuming it raw. So from what I can see online, the majority of criticisms seem to be directly or indirectly tied to the game's length, and that people don't actually have any issue with how the alien presents itself in game or the mechanics that you engage with, simply the fact that they felt it shouldn't have been as long as it was. But as an Aliens fan, I categorically disagree. I don't think people realize that when you develop a game at that scale with the budget they had, you kind of have to deliver a certain number of hours of experience. I mean, the gaming community in general is pretty litigious, and everyone is trying to measure their investment down to the minute. And whilst concise and refined experiences can be fantastic, sometimes people just want a surplus. Which was one of the criticisms about the game's length regarding when it should have ended. If you haven't played the game, spoiler alert here. A lot of people thought that it should have ended after Mission 10 once you'd ejected the alien into the gas giant. And for me personally, if the game had have ended there, I would have been quite disappointed in that. I like the idea that there are multiple aliens running around, because after Mission 10, the first time you play, you assume that the threat is over, and now it becomes just navigating around Sevastopol to resolve the issues that already exist. I like the question that this is asking. Are you being pursued by one alien or by many? Because there's no way that you can actually identify the alien by any markings, so it's entirely plausible that there are multiple aliens running around the station, which is why so much chaos is occurring simultaneously. This is also why that I disagree with the idea that the game shouldn't have pursued the aliens-like motif with the alien hive in Mission 14. Again, I think it's a more terrifying realization to know that there are multiple aliens running about, so even if you dispatch one or find a way to distract one, there are still others that can pursue you. I think this was also a smart move from the developers who wanted to have some aliens-like nostalgia involved in their game. As whilst it's true that Alien is the foundation and establishment of the universe, Aliens really hammered home this idea of the colonial marines versus the aliens in a more combative way. I think the developers were trying to appeal to the broadest audience that they could, They of course wanted the die-hard Alien and Aliens fans, but I think they also wanted to be able to appeal to people who would just enjoy a horror story-driven epic as well. I think there's also a possibility that the linear nature of the game feels too restrictive for some players. For example, I think the station layout was good, and there are a few times where you backtrack through certain areas, but I think it would have been even more immersive if you could move around the station more independently, a more bespoke player-directed experience, allowing certain scripted events to be triggered at different times. I've also seen some ideas on certain threads about how it would have been interesting to have more of a morality-based system for good and bad actions within the game, helping and saving NPCs versus killing them, as well as the implementation of more RPG-like elements, being able to interact with more characters in the world, secondary objectives, and just a way to explore and experience the station without being constantly beckoned to push the story forward. I certainly think having a few more character relationships develop over a longer period of time would have helped this game's narrative, but whilst I felt like the characters were perfectly serviceable, they certainly are one of the weaker elements of the game. And I don't think that's due to the fact that they're poorly written. I just don't think the format of the game really lends itself for you to get to know these people in a way that you're going to give a shit about their outcome. I've also read some criticisms about the game's dialogue, and it's not Tolkien or Shakespearean level prose, but it's good enough for the story. There's a few lackluster deliveries, but overall, it's nothing that most games don't deal with. But overall, I thought the game did a good job at having a slight derivation from the first and second movie. I like the inclusion of Ripley's daughter into the game. I think it's a good way to connect the worlds. I found the inclusion of the corporate greed and espionage plot from Weyland-Yutani to secure the Xeno for what can only be assumed as something pretty insidious as always a classic motivation in this world. I think Amanda's desire to find out what happened to her mother was a good way to combine the motivations of herself and the inhabitants of Sevastopol. The fact that Amanda has to continue to learn and explore to understand the nature of what is happening, and that is going to involve walking around and looking at shit and using computers. It can't just always be kill Xenos or destroy this hive or blow this thing up. I definitely think being able to save some of the characters or some more moral choices that might have impacted the outcome for certain groups would have been a good addition. Perhaps even a larger focus on some of the survivors of the station and the factions that arose during these desperate situations. I also think for maximum replayability, they needed a more comprehensive map of the station and an easier way to traverse around, which I think lends itself more to an RPG open world type Alien experience where things are more random and less scripted outside of core plot events, but still maintaining a prioritization of stealth and defense before deliberate engagement, but also allowing more influence from the characters within the world and the station's inhabitants. However, this is all just retroactive wishlist posturing. The only other entry that even remotely matches the atmosphere from this game was the most recent Aliens Dark Descent. That takes a lot more direction from the second movie as opposed to the first, but still a fantastic adaptation into an interactive format, because most other content have been a bigger letdown than housing affordability. I mean, Aliens 3 in my mind was the property that can be afforded the most concessions and goodwill from the fans. Relentless studio interference, a script getting rewritten 45 times, landing on an utterly miserable story arc that completely undid the entire previous movie was not a big brain move. The technical issues and poor CG also really date that movie, but really it's the gratuitously dark plot that just makes it such a misery to watch. Aliens Resurrection is an irredeemable pile of regurgitated vomit slop that was made to milk the last remaining shreds of the franchise in the 90s. Then you get the non-canonical movies, which don't exactly inspire a new audience to come seek out this world. Then of course you get Ridley's editions, which really just confused everybody and kind of retconned the previous entries. So at the end of all that we have Isolation, standing in the same vein as Aliens 1 and 2, surrounded by the tombstones of other miscalculated attempts to continue the Aliens franchise. A game that reminds everyone of what can be achieved when you care about the material you are using, where you dedicate yourself to recapturing and creating an experience that provided such a visceral and emotional response that made those stories so important and worth exploring in the first place. Placing a higher priority on gameplay, world building, and immersion over monetization. 10 plus years old and this game still appears in the list of best horror games ever made. So I guess we should count ourselves lucky that we get one good Alien property every 10 years. And considering that a sequel has been announced to Alien Isolation, we can only hope that that comes sooner rather than later. I don't envy the task that development team has ahead of them, because I don't know where you go exactly from here, because you can't just remake that same game. That format would not be tolerated as well now. It could be a good opportunity to do a more Aliens actions-like experience. I think that's what people seem to have an appetite for. But who really knows, there's a lot of ways that could go wrong. But Alien Isolation is definitely part of that collection of small Aliens properties that are held in the highest regard when it comes to artistic and creative merit and integrity, and is reflected by the continued praise and engagement from the Aliens community. So go buy it.